Book Talk begins at 6 minutes and 13 seconds.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 680, The Captain. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our lovely viewers, listeners, and supporters. That's people at patreon.com, at craftlit.com/membership, and users of the app who are getting the premium feed. This week, I would very much like to thank our new Patreon patrons. We have Melanie, and then another Melanie Conradi, Elma Tulinius, and Matthew Morris Coombe. Thank you so much for your support. Truly, we could not do this without you. So thank you. Hello, how are you? I have figured out that I can't actually hold even a remotely sort of part-time job, which really stinks. But if you have noticed that there has been a gap in Vindication on the Rights of Women episodes, this is why. I started doing every other Tuesday. I started doing talks at a retirement home on literature. It's what I do. This should be easy, right? It's an hour away. And the drive combined with the stress of coming up with the slides for each talk, I can't. I actually can't do it. It stopped everything else in its tracks because it takes me 5 days, a week and a half to recover. Anyway, I've put some links to long COVID and MECFS information. I've put it in the show notes. And if you know anybody with, obviously, long COVID or MECFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, or Epstein-Barr, sometimes that's called Epstein-Barr, or MS even, they might be interested in the podcast episode that I'm linking to, because all of those get mentioned directly by name. And the guy who is talking is at Yale, and he's fascinating. So if you have anybody in your life who's like that, please pass that information on to them. It may do them some good, because there is actually at least one plausible treatment out there that makes sense to me. That isn't snake oil. By the way, no shade being cast on snake oil. We have a copy of the game. I think it's a Canadian game called Snake Oil. It is the most fun you can have with a broad range of ages. We played with 6-year-old to a 76-year-old and had a great time. So big win with snake oil. I just don't want to, spread real, ugly, useless snake oil around. Just the game. We'll put a link to the game in the show notes as well. So I promised you that this month we would have a raffle option, and I was not lying. So here is our raffle item for the month of April 2025. For April 2025, we have the book Knitting Comfortably. It's an ergonomic book, and boy, does it have all the things in it. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the entire table of contents, all 2 pages. It is chock full of information for anybody who does anything repetitive with their hands. It's got great diagrams. It's got really, really great photographs. And honestly, it's useful for anybody. You don't have to be a knitter. Anybody who does anything repetitive with their arms, hands, upper body. Repetition is definitely an important part of what they're trying to deal with in this book, but I also really appreciate the book's fabulous sense of humor. You know I do. So that donation is very much appreciated. As always, we will be using Rafflecopter for entering this raffle. We are adding new different things that you can do on Rafflecopter all the time. So take a look at all the options for entry. Some of them cost money because you could join Patreon. Some of them absolutely don't. They take, 15 seconds. So it's totally up to you. We want to make sure that we give everybody an option and that we don't make it impossible for somebody to enter the raffle for any CraftLit item that we raffle off. If you have something particularly special, whether it's you're trying to destash or something like that, and you would like to send that in or let me know that you would like to raffle it off to a fabulous CraftLit person, please let me know because that's super easy to do. Heather@craftlit.com, or you can call 206-350-1642. Or if you live internationally and don't want to fork out the money for an international call, you can use our Speak Pipe link. That is also in the show notes. So, this week's book talk. I called this episode The Captain because I think 10 years ago, I had an episode called Eek, a Man. And I could have done that this week, but I thought, no, I've actually already done that before. In 680 episodes, you kind of expect that I would wind up repeating myself. I know I have. Even sometimes within a book. Age, whatever. So, The Captain. We learned last week very clearly that Cranford is a town of Amazons. It's a matriarchal society. Guys may move there, but then, slowly they kind of figure out that they are needed in London or Manchester in this case. Drumble being the Cranford name for Manchester. It's an analog for Manchester because this is all taking place in the north of England. Proudly. So it should be a surprise to find out that this week's chapter is The Captain, because living in that gendered society, of course, the captain is going to be a man. I've mentioned that the Cranford miniseries that Judi Dench is in is marvelous. The man who plays the captain, if you watched Downton Abbey, you will recognize him. And I don't think I even have to tell you which of the characters on Downton Abbey is portraying the captain. But his basso profundo voice is perfect. He is a marvelous, marvelous captain. So if you haven't watched or if you are waiting to watch later, either way, which is fine. Honestly, this book is episodic. There's no building conflict or drama. So if you watch it all now, all you're going to wind up doing is recognizing like, ooh, this wasn't in the miniseries, and it's not going to ruin anything for you. So it does give you a very nice visual for some of these women. They just cast it beautifully. I know I said that last week. Anyway, the captain is wonderful. I also forgot to mention last week we learned kind of who the people are in general, and we learned how their gentility works. And my favorite bit of that was when they were all going to one woman's home. She's very poor. She can't even afford a real servant. She has a schoolgirl who comes and helps her. And so she has a very small home and has to leave the tea tray underneath the sofa. And so the little maid girl has to go retrieve it after the party has already started, and so the women were sitting there and then had to, shift around to give her access. And then Gaskell has that she knew that we knew that she didn't have a tea tray that was large enough, and we knew that she knew that we knew, and she knew that we knew that she knew that we knew. I found that to be so modern, a joke, like kind of actual slapsticky kind of writing. And it reminded me that Elizabeth Gaskell is a lot harder to pin down because while North and South is a very serious book, and there's not a lot of actual humor in it ever that I can think of. If you look at Elizabeth Gaskell's letters, or if you go to her home Or if you think about the fact that she was working for and with Charles Dickens for years. Actually, she may have still been working for him when she died, when she passed away. I don't think Charles Dickens would like you very much if you didn't have a sense of humor, and I think he particularly wouldn't have liked women very much in a collegial way if they didn't have a sense of humor. I'm throwing it out there. I have no idea if I'm just making stuff up. But yeah, the humor in Cranford makes me think she was funnier than I would have given her credit for when we were doing North and South. So that's kinda cool. Ooh, I am drinking tea. I'm drinking tea because I don't feel well, but I am drinking Plum Deluxe Bookshop Blend White.
Plum Deluxe Tea and CraftLit are back together again. Visit bit.ly/craftlit-pdt, that's P Plum, D Deluxe, TEA, so that you can see the CraftLit collection of Plum Deluxe teas, and then use code LIT2025 on your next order for a special CraftLit discount. Enjoy.
It feels very soothing to the tongue and also to my brain, which is nice. Okay. I also need to preemptively explain something about this book. I didn't mention it last week, and I don't really need to mention it this week, except that somebody is gonna start to wonder, because I did. Who's the narrator? Who is telling us this story? The answer is you actually really don't find out until much later, and her name is Mary Smith. She comes to visit. When she visits, she either stays with the Miss Jenkinses or she stays with Miss Pole. She used to live in Cranford. She now lives in the Manchester analog in Drumble. And yeah, she's kind of just a blank slate, and obviously, when they do the miniseries, they have to cast somebody. So there is an actress playing Mary Smith, and it works out just fine. But it is a little odd that you start to go, "Well, who is telling us all of this?" Mary Smith. Now you know. Doesn't matter. It's just a thing to file away, and yeah, that's it. So, okay, things to know before we head into today's chapter. A bakehouse. In towns and villages that were big enough to have a bakery, a dedicated bakery where you could go and buy, bread, those ovens had to be substantial if you were gonna bake enough bread to basically feed the town. Those substantial ovens retained their heat for quite a while. If you were poor or actually, no, if you were just of limited means, you very well may be living someplace that doesn't have an oven at all. It might have like a stove, a Franklin stove type thing for heat, and you can boil things on top of that, trust me, because I have, but not an oven. So people were able to go once the bread baking for the day was done, you could take a pot down to the bakehouse, and they would put it in their oven for you so that it could use the heat that was remaining as it started to die down. You could cook your stuff there because it's plenty hot enough. So you could make, nothing magnificently special, but you could certainly make a big pot of, well, maybe not stew. Well, yeah, but depending on what you put in it, it could be a stew, soup, roasts, anything. But it was just a cool thing that's part of village life. I know one of the reasons why I really wanted to do Cranford is because this village life is very supportive. It takes a village, but also because of the gentility and kind of funny side of gentility, the giving everybody a little bit of grace to be their own quirky self. I really appreciated. So the bakehouse is just, I think, an extension of that same vibe, which made me happy. There's a reference to a place called Flint's, Flints. This is a haberdasher in London. Haberdashery is where you get hats and trimmings and things like trimmings for hats, things like that. But it's also mentioned in a song, Country Commissions to My Cousin in Town. This was I don't know if you'd call it a mock song, a mocking song, definitely. It was a song written by somebody who had a lot of family scattered out in the countryside, and they lived in, at least part-time, in London. And every time they had to go to London to do work, somebody's like, "Oh, could you bring me back some fabric? Oh, could you bring me back some?" So, it was so prevalent, it's a song. Just file that away, it'll make sense. The biblical DebORah was a tough babe. If you wanna read more about her, you can read her in Judges, at least in, chapter 4, verse 4. Yeah, she's tough. Don't mess with any DebORah. DebORah puts the emphasis on the right syllable for Hebrew. Strong-minded. When you're talking about women in this period, well, let's be honest, if you're talking about women and anybody says that they are strong-minded, it is probably an insult. This goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft. I think at this point, I've already released the episode where she talks oh, yeah, I know, I totally did, where she talks about masculine women. People weren't talking about women coming across as butch. That was not what they were upset about. They were upset about masculine women being the kind of women who were usurping the proper place of men in intellectual society. So if a woman, read Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau and had an opinion about them, trying to voice those opinions put them at risk for being called a masculine woman. Totally an insult. Strong-minded is the parallel. And and the cool thing to know is that at this time when this book is being written, suffrage is already under discussion. So women's equality, and this is important. When they're talking about this kind of equality, they're not talking about like, if you're a fireman, I'm a girl, I should be able to be a fireman too, just because I want to be a fireman. No, it would be if you can meet the standard, you have met the standard, period. The standard is the standard, no matter whether you're female, male, or intersex, it doesn't matter. They're actually talking about a societal level of equality that would have given women, for instance, access to own their own business, or divorce a brutal husband, or receive an entailed property, or open their own bank account. All of these things, they were saying, we have to learn to read and write because if you look at our hand-stitched samplers, the alphabet and words were always on those samplers. The women were plenty literate. In fact, I think at the Irish Museum, we saw I think it was at the Irish Museum, the Military Museum in Dublin. There was a girl's sampler. I think she was 8, 9, 10, something like that. She had a chunk of text written out on that, and next to that, they actually had a contract that her father signed with an X. Process it for a moment. The 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old girl could read and write. She copied out biblical passages. Her dad couldn't sign his own name. So I think women were definitely feeling the, "How much more do we need to do to prove to you that we can actually learn stuff and make decisions? We have to run the household. We have to do the economizing. We are the ones who are managing all this stuff. Give me legal rights, dude. Stop. Don't bogart my legal rights." So, yeah, suffrage was fully in swing already. Elizabeth Gaskell does something that Mary Wollstonecraft also does, where she sort of kind of quotes, but maybe actually misquotes people all the time. Usually, it's because she's not stopping to go look it up. She's assuming that when she says it, you're going to know what she's talking about. So at one point, she talks about plumed wars, which is actually a conflation of two parts of a sentence in Othello, Act 3, Scene 3, lines 353 to 354, where the line is basically plumed troops and big wars. She combines it to plumed wars. But, if you love Othello, you might have heard that and gone, Brunonian. Elizabeth Gaskell's making up words, man. Brunonian, like Jeffersonian, except for Captain Brown. Therefore, the things that he does, those things are Brunonian. I love that. Feast of Reason and the Flow of Soul. That comes from an Alexander Pope, Imitations of Horace. This is a book he wrote in 1733, and it is satire, like most of what Alexander Pope wrote. It is also poetry, like most of what he wrote. There's a phrase, the well of English undefiled. It's sort of a callback to Spenser's The Faerie Queene, which was written in 1596. And it's Act 4, Scene 3, line 32. And I don't know, if you've read The Faerie Queene, you might remember. I never want to leave out those throwaway allusions because sometimes people go, wait, I would like to know more about that. And now you can. Nasty, cruel railroads. You are going to hear railroads referred to as nasty, cruel things. People were, and in some cases still are, always arguing about innovation and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Arthur Dent says, I've gone off progress. It's overrated. In order for trains to be put in, they had to destroy previously virgin lands. I mean, deforested, sure, but virgin lands, often people's farms and things. And they had to blast through hills and things like that as well. And all that rubble had to be cleared by hand. My God. The economic benefit to everyone for having public transportation was massive. But the cost to people who lived in the hinterlands was also massive. Not to mention the fact that the blasting was loud, scared your livestock, was not pretty. The trains, cut up the view, but also they killed people. Anytime you've got blasting going on, something's going to go wrong. A rock is going to go flying the wrong way. Or there's the story of the guy who got the railroad spike through his head, survived, and had a completely changed personality because some part of his brain got destroyed and other parts of his brain took over and different personality. That kind of thing happened all the time and usually with a less pleasant outcome. So there were lots of reasons for people to view this kind of progress as nasty and cruel. Not unlike Robert Moses and the Cross Bronx Expressway. Did it help move people around faster? Yes. It also destroyed the Bronx. Entire neighborhoods that were very, very functional and happy and great have been decimated. And now everybody has lung cancer because of the pollution. So, progress is sometimes overrated depending on where you stand. There is a marvelous description, and it's kind of a stream of consciousness description. Like Mary Smith is creating this impression in her own mind as she is sharing it with us, that there's a moment where a bonnet starts to look like a helmet or a jockey cap. All of these caps could look similar, but with very, very different connotations behind them. Obviously, the bonnet being very female and the helmet and the jockey cap being more male. The important thing to know is that caps, like the little dust ruffle caps that women wore, they were already out of date by this time. So wearing a cap underneath your bonnet had passed out of favor at this point. However, I believe almost all the women in Cranford are still wearing caps. Economy is the watchword. Just to give you some frame of reference, 20 pounds a year is less than the lowest pay for a governess at this time. And that's bad, as we know. And P.S., the governess would have been paid a little bit more, even in a poor family or in a bad situation. She would have also had room and board provided to her as part of her quote unquote pay. if you're trying to survive on £20 a year, that's less than the governess would have made and no room and board. So just putting that in context for you. Galignani's messenger. I had never heard of this before, but I remember that when my dad was traveling a lot in the 80s and 90s, he'd come back with International Herald Tribune newspapers, because that's what the English reading world, the Western English reading world, that's where you could get your news easily if you were overseas. All the airports, all the train stations, everywhere, you could get the International Herald Tribune. I have no idea if they're still in publication. No clue. But Galignani's Messenger was that. It was a widely distributed European publication by an Italian living in Paris, and it was designed for the English-speaking traveler because it was bringing news out of England and Ireland and also focusing on news on the continent that would affect those places. So you could kind of still get slightly out of date, but still reasonably recent information. So, notable deaths and births would have been in there. Things that Parliament was doing would have been in there. All of that. The progress with the railroads would have been in there. So I just thought that was kind of cool that they did that. Smart guy, and a really cool thing, making the world a little bit smaller by keeping everybody in touch. All right. If you are listening to your own version of Cranford, you can fast wind to
1 hour, 2 minutes, and 58 seconds.
And if you're listening here, we will listen together to Noel Badrian as he reads for us Chapter 2 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Here we go.
Chapter 2 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. The Captain. It was impossible to live a month at Cranford and not know the daily habits of each resident, and long before my visit was ended, I knew much concerning the whole Brown trio. There was nothing new to be discovered respecting their poverty, for they had spoken simply and openly about that from the very first. They made no mystery of the necessity for their being economical. All that remained to be discovered was the captain's infinite kindness of heart, and the various modes in which, unconsciously to himself, he manifested it. Some little anecdotes were talked about for some time after they occurred. As we did not read much, and as all the ladies were pretty well suited with servants, there was a dearth of subjects for conversation. We therefore discussed the circumstance of the captain taking a poor old woman's dinner out of her hands one very slippery Sunday. He had met her returning from the bakehouse as he came from church, and noticed her precarious footing, and with the grave dignity with which he did everything, he relieved her of her burden, and steered along the street by her side, carrying her baked mutton and potatoes safely home. This was thought very eccentric, and it was rather expected that he would pay a round of calls on the Monday morning to explain and apologize to the Cranford sense of propriety. But he did no such thing, and then it was decided that he was ashamed and was keeping out of sight. In a kindly pity for him, we began to say, after all, the Sunday morning's occurrence showed a great goodness of heart, and it was resolved that he should be comforted on his next appearance among us. But lo, he came down upon us untouched by any sense of shame, speaking loud and bass as ever, his head thrown back, his wig as jaunty and well curled as usual, and we were obliged to conclude he had forgotten all about Sunday. Miss Pole and Miss Jessie Brown had set up a kind of intimacy on the strength of the Shetland wool and the new knitting stitches. So it happened that when I went to visit Miss Pole, I saw more of the Browns than I had done while staying with Miss Jenkins, who had never got over what she called Captain Brown's disparaging remarks upon Dr. Johnson as a writer of light and agreeable fiction. I found that Miss Brown was seriously ill of some lingering incurable complaint, the pain occasioned by which gave the uneasy expression to her face that I had taken for unmitigated crossness. Cross, too, she was at times, when the nervous irritability occasioned by her disease became past endurance. Miss Jessie bore with her at these times even more patiently than she did with the bitter self-upbraidings by which they were invariably succeeded. Miss Brown used to accuse herself not merely of hasty and irritable temper, but also of being the cause why her father and sister were obliged to pinch, in order to allow her the small luxuries which were necessaries in her condition. She would so fain have made sacrifices for them, and have lightened their cares, that the original generosity of her disposition added acerbity to her temper. All this was borne by Miss Jessie and her father with more than placidity, with absolute tenderness. I forgave Miss Jessie her singing out of tune, and her juvenility of dress, when I saw her at home. I came to perceive that Captain Brown's dark Brutus wig and padded coat, alas, too often threadbare, were remnants of the military smartness of his youth, which he now wore unconsciously. He was a man of infinite resources, gained in his barrack experience. As he confessed, no one could black his boots to please him except himself. But, indeed, he was not above saving the little maidservant's labours in every way, knowing, most likely, that his daughter's illness made the place a hard one. He endeavoured to make peace with Miss Jenkins, soon after the memorable dispute I have named, by a present of a wooden fire-shovel, his own making, having heard her say how much the grating of an iron one annoyed her. She received the present with cool gratitude, and thanked him formally. When he was gone, she bade me put it away in the lumber-room, feeling, probably, that no present from a man who preferred Mr. Boz to Dr. Johnson could be less jarring than an iron fire-shovel. Such was the state of things when I left Cranford and went to Drumble. I had, however, several correspondents who kept me au fait as to the proceedings of the dear little town. There was Miss Pole, who was becoming as much absorbed in crochet as she had been once in knitting, and the burden of whose letter was something like, "But don't you forget the white worsted at Flint's," of the old song, for at the end of every sentence of news came a fresh direction as to some crochet commission which I was to execute for her. Miss Matilda Jenkins, who did not mind being called Miss Matty when Miss Jenkins was not by, wrote nice, kind, rambling letters, now and then venturing into an opinion of her own, but suddenly pulling herself up, and either begging me not to name what she had said, as DebORah thought differently, and she knew, or else putting a postscript to the effect that, since writing the above, she had been talking over the subject with DebORah, and was quite convinced that, etc. Here probably followed a recantation of every opinion she had given in the letter. Then came Miss Jenkins, DebORah, as she liked Miss Matty to call her, her father having once said that the Hebrew name ought to be so pronounced. I secretly think she took the Hebrew prophetess for a model in character, and, indeed, she was not unlike the stern prophetess in some ways, making allowance, of course, for modern customs and difference in dress. Miss Jenkins wore a cravat and a little bonnet like a jockey cap, and altogether had the appearance of a strong-minded woman, although she would have despised the modern idea of women being equal to men. Equal, indeed. She knew they were superior. But to return to her letters. Everything in them was stately and grand, like herself. I have been looking them over, dear Miss Jenkins, how I honoured her. And I will give an extract, more especially because it relates to our friend Captain Brown. The Honourable Mrs. Jameson has only just quitted me, and in the course of conversation she communicated to me the intelligence that she had yesterday received a call from her revered husband's quondam friend, Lord Mauleverer. You will not easily conjecture what brought his lordship within the precincts of our little town. It was to see Captain Brown, with whom, it appears, his lordship was acquainted in the Plumed Wars, and who had the privilege of averting destruction from his lordship's head when some great peril was impending over it, off the misnomered Cape of Good Hope. You know our friend the Honourable Mrs. Jameson's deficiency in the spirit of innocent curiosity, and you will therefore not be so much surprised when I tell you she was quite unable to disclose to me the exact nature of the peril in question. I was anxious, I confess, to ascertain in what manner Captain Brown, with his limited establishment, could receive so distinguished a guest, and I discovered that his lordship retired to rest, and, let us hope, to refreshing slumbers at the Angel Hotel, but shared the Brunonian meals during the 2 days that he honoured Cranford with his august presence. Mrs. Johnson, our civil butcher's wife, informs me that Miss Jessie purchased a leg of lamb, but besides this I can hear of no preparation whatever to give a suitable reception to so distinguished a visitor. Perhaps they entertained him with the feast of reason and the flow of soul. And to us, who are acquainted with Captain Brown's sad want of relish for the pure wells of English undefiled, it may be matter for congratulation that he has had the opportunity of improving his taste by holding converse with an elegant and refined member of the British aristocracy. But from some mundane failings who is altogether free? Miss Pole and Miss Matty wrote to me by the same post. Such a piece of news as Lord Mauleverer's visit was not to be lost on the Cranford letter-writers. They made the most of it. Miss Matty humbly apologized for writing at the same time as her sister, who was so much more capable than she to describe the honour done to Cranford. But, in spite of a little bad spelling, Miss Matty's account gave me the best idea of the commotion occasioned by his lordship's visit after it had occurred. For, except the people at the Angel, the Browns, Mrs. Jameson, and a little lad his lordship had sworn at for driving a dirty hoop against the aristocratic legs, I could not hear of anyone with whom his lordship had held conversation. My next visit to Cranford was in the summer. There had been neither births, deaths, nor marriages since I was there last. Everybody lived in the same house, and wore pretty nearly the same well-preserved, old-fashioned clothes. The greatest event was that the Miss Jenkinses had purchased a new carpet for the drawing-room. Oh, the busy work Miss Matty and I had in chasing the sunbeams, as they fell in an afternoon right down on this carpet through the blindless window. We spread newspapers over the places, and sat down to our book or our work, and lo, in a quarter of an hour the sun had moved, and was blazing away on a fresh spot, and down again we went on our knees to alter the position of the newspapers. We were very busy too, one whole morning before Miss Jenkins gave her party, in following her directions and in cutting out and stitching together pieces of newspaper so as to form little paths to every chair, set for the expected visitors, lest their shoes might dirty or defile the purity of the carpet. Do you make paper paths for every guest to walk upon in London? Captain Brown and Miss Jenkins were not very cordial to each other. The literary dispute, of which I had seen the beginning, was a roar, the slightest touch on which made them wince. It was the only difference of opinion they had ever had, but that difference was enough. Miss Jenkins could not refrain from talking at Captain Brown, and though he did not reply, he drummed with his fingers, which action she felt and resented as very disparaging to Dr. Johnson. He was rather ostentatious in his preference of the writings of Mr. Boz, and would walk through the streets so absorbed in them that he all but ran against Miss Jenkins, and though his apologies were earnest and sincere, and though he did not, in fact, do more than startle her and himself, she owned to me she had rather he had knocked her down, if he had only been reading a higher style of literature. The poor brave captain! He looked older and more worn, and his clothes were very threadbare. but he seemed as bright and cheerful as ever, unless he was asked about his daughter's health. She suffers a great deal, and she must suffer more. We do what we can to alleviate her pain. God's will be done. He took off his hat at these last words. I found from Miss Matty that everything had been done, in fact. A medical man of high repute in that country neighbourhood had been sent for, and every injunction he had given was attended to, regardless of expense. Miss Matty was sure they denied themselves many things in order to make the invalid comfortable, but they never spoke about it. And as for Miss Jessie, I really think she's an angel, said poor Miss Matty, quite overcome. To see her way of bearing with Miss Brown's crossness, and the bright face she puts on after she has been sitting up a whole night and scolded above half of it, is quite beautiful. Yet she looks as neat and as ready to welcome the captain at breakfast time as if she had been asleep in the Queen's bed all night. My dear, you could never laugh at her prim little curls and her pink bows again if you saw her as I have done. I could only feel very penitent and greet Miss Jessie with double respect when I met her next. She looked faded and pinched, and her lips began to quiver as if she were very weak when she spoke of her sister. But she brightened and sent back the tears that were glittering in her pretty eyes as she said, "But to be sure, what a town Cranford is for kindness! I don't suppose anyone has a better dinner than usual cooked, but the best part of all comes in a little covered basin for my sister. The poor people will leave their earliest vegetables at our door for her. They speak short and gruff, as if they were ashamed of it, but I'm sure it often goes to my heart to see their thoughtfulness." The tears now came back and overflowed, but after a minute or two she began to scold herself, and ended by going away the same cheerful Miss Jessie as ever. "But why does not this Lord Mauleverer do something for the man who saved his life?" said I. "Why, you see, unless Captain Brown has some reason for it, he never speaks about being poor, and he walked along by his lordship looking as happy and cheerful as a prince. And as they never called attention to their dinner by apologies, and as Miss Brown was better that day, and all seemed bright, I dare say his lordship never knew how much care there was in the background. He did send game in the winter pretty often, but now he is gone abroad." I had often occasion to notice the use that was made of fragments and small opportunities in Cranford. The rose-leaves that were gathered ere they fell to make into a potpourri for someone who had no garden, the little bundles of lavender flowers sent to strew the drawers of some town dweller, or to burn in the chamber of some invalid. Things that many would despise, and actions which it seemed scarcely worthwhile to perform, were all attended to in Cranford. Miss Jenkins stuck an apple full of cloves, to be heated and smell pleasantly in Miss Brown's room, and as she put in each clove she uttered a Johnsonian sentence. Indeed, she never could think of the Browns without talking Johnson, and as they were seldom absent from her thoughts just then, I heard many a rolling three-piled sentence. Captain Brown called one day to thank Miss Jenkins for many little kindnesses, which I did not know until then that she had rendered. He had suddenly become like an old man. His deep bass voice had a quavering in it. His eyes looked dim, and the lines on his face were deep. He did not, could not, speak cheerfully of his daughter's state, but he talked with manly, pious resignation, and not much. Twice over he said, "What Jessie has been to us, God only knows." And after the second time he got up hastily, shook hands all round without speaking, and left the room. That afternoon we perceived little groups in the street, all listening with faces aghast to some tale or other. Miss Jenkins wondered what could be the matter for some time before she took the undignified step of sending Jenny out to inquire. Jenny came back with a white face of terror. "Oh, ma'am! Oh, Miss Jenkins, ma'am! Captain Brown is killed by them nasty, cruel railroads," and she burst into tears. She, along with many others, had experienced the poor captain's kindness. "How? Where? Good God, Jenny, don't waste time in crying, but tell us something." Miss Matty rushed out into the street at once and collared the man who was telling the tale. Come to my sister at once, Miss Jenkins, the rector's daughter." "Oh, man, say it is not true," she cried, as she brought the affrighted Carter sleeking down his hair into the drawing-room, where he stood with his wet boots on the new carpet, and no one regarded it. "Please, mum, it is true. I seed it myself," and he shuddered at the recollection. "The captain was a-reading some new book as he was deep in, a-waiting for the down train, and there was a little lass as wanted to come to its mammy, and gave its sister the slip, and came toddling across the line. And he looked up sudden at the sound of the train coming, and seed the child, and he darted on the line and cotched it up, and his foot slipped, and the train came over him in no time." "Oh, Lord, mum, it's quite true, and they've come over to tell his daughters. The child's safe, though, with only a bang on its shoulder as he threw it to its mammy. Poor captain would be glad of that, mum, wouldn't he? God bless him." The great rough Carter puckered up his manly face and turned away to hide his tears. I turned to Miss Jenkins. She looked very ill, as if she were going to faint, and signed to me to open the window. "Matilda, bring me my bonnet. I must go to those girls. God pardon me if ever I have spoken contemptuously to the captain." Miss Jenkins arrayed herself to go out, telling Miss Matilda to give the man a glass of wine. While she was away, Miss Matty and I huddled over the fire, talking in a low and awestruck voice. I know we cried quietly all the time. Miss Jenkins came home in a silent mood, and we durst not ask her many questions. She told us that Miss Jessie had fainted, and that she and Miss Pole had had some difficulty in bringing her round, but that, as soon as she recovered, she begged one of them to go and sit with her sister. "Mr. Hoggins says she cannot live many days, and she shall be spared this shock," said Miss Jessie, shivering with feelings to which she dared not give way. "But how can you manage, my dear?" asked Miss Jenkins. "You cannot bear up. She must see your tears." "God will help me. I will not give way. She was asleep when the news came. She may be asleep yet. She would be so utterly miserable, not merely at my father's death, but to think of what would become of me. She is so good to me." She looked up earnestly in their faces with her soft, true eyes, and Miss Pole told Miss Jenkins afterwards she could hardly bear it, knowing, as she did, how Miss Brown treated her sister. However, it was settled according to Miss Jessie's wish. Miss Brown was to be told her father had been summoned to take a short journey on railway business. They had managed it in some way. Miss Jenkins could not exactly say how. Miss Pole was to stop with Miss Jessie. Mrs. Jameson had sent to inquire, and this was all we heard that night, and a sorrowful night it was. The next day a full account of the fatal accident was in the county paper, which Miss Jenkins took in. Her eyes were very weak, she said, and she asked me to read it. When I came to the gallant gentleman was deeply engaged in the perusal of a number of Pickwick which he had just received. Miss Jenkins shook her head long and solemnly, and then sighed out, "Poor dear infatuated man." The corpse was to be taken from the station to the parish church, there to be interred. Miss Jessie had set her heart on following it to the grave, and no dissuasives could alter her resolve. Her restraint upon herself made her most obstinate. She resisted all Miss Pole's entreaties and Miss Jenkins's advice. At last Miss Jenkins gave up the point, and after a silence, which I feared portended some deep displeasure against Miss Jessie, Miss Jenkins said she should accompany the latter to the funeral. "It is not fit for you to go alone. It would be against both propriety and humanity were I to allow it." Miss Jessie seemed as if she did not half like this arrangement, but her obstinacy, if she had any, had been exhausted in her determination to go to the interment. She longed, poor thing, I have no doubt, to cry alone over the grave of the dear father to whom she had been all in all, and to give way for one little half-hour uninterrupted by sympathy and unobserved by friendship. But it was not to be. That afternoon Miss Jenkins sent out for a yard of black crape, and employed herself busily in trimming the little black silk bonnet I have spoken about. When it was finished, she put it on, and looked at us for approbation. Admiration she despised. I was full of sorrow, but, by one of those whimsical thoughts which come unbidden into our heads in times of deepest grief, I no sooner saw the bonnet than I was reminded of a helmet, and in that hybrid bonnet, half helmet, half jockey cap, did Miss Jenkins attend Captain Brown's funeral, and, I believe, supported Miss Jessie with a tender, indulgent firmness which was invaluable, allowing her to weep her passionate fill before they left. Miss Pole, Miss Matty, and I, meanwhile, attended to Miss Brown, and hard work we found it to relieve her querulous and never-ending complaints. But if we were so weary and dispirited, what must Miss Jessie have been? Yet she came back almost calm, as if she had gained a new strength. She put off her morning dress, and came in, looking pale and gentle, thanking us each with a soft, long pressure of the hand. She could even smile, a faint, sweet, wintry smile, as if to reassure us of her power to endure, but her look made our eyes fill suddenly with tears, more than if she had cried outright. It was settled that Miss Pole was to remain with her all the watching livelong night, and that Miss Matty and I were to return in the morning to relieve them, and give Miss Jessie the opportunity for a few hours of sleep. But when the morning came, Miss Jenkins appeared at the breakfast-table, equipped in her helmet bonnet, and ordered Miss Matty to stay at home, as she meant to go and help to nurse. She was evidently in a state of great friendly excitement, which she showed by eating her breakfast standing, and scolding the household all round. No nursing, no energetic, strong-minded woman could help Miss Brown now. There was that in the room as we entered which was stronger than us all, and made us shrink into solemn, awestruck helplessness. Miss Brown was dying. We hardly knew her voice. It was so devoid of the complaining tone we had always associated with it. Miss Jessie told me afterwards that it, and her face too, were just what they had been formerly, when her mother's death left her the young, anxious head of the family, of whom only Miss Jessie survived. She was conscious of her sister's presence, though not, I think, of ours. We stood a little behind the curtain. Miss Jessie knelt with her face near her sister's, in order to catch the last soft, awful whispers. "Oh, Jessie, Jessie, how selfish I have been. God forgive me for letting you sacrifice yourself for me as you did. I have so loved you, and yet I have thought only of myself. God forgive me." "Hush, love, hush," said Miss Jessie, sobbing. "And my father, my dear, dear father, I will not complain now, if God will give me strength to be patient. But oh, Jessie, tell my father how I longed and yearned to see him at last, and to ask his forgiveness. He can never know how I loved him. Oh, if I might but tell him before I die. What a life of sorrow his has been, and I have done so little to cheer him." A light came into Miss Jessie's face. "Would it comfort you, dearest, to think that he does know? Would it comfort you, love, to know that his cares, his sorrows—" Her voice quivered, but she steadied it into calmness. "Mary, he has gone before you to the place where the weary are at rest. He knows now how you loved him." A strange look, which was not distress, came over Miss Brown's face. She did not speak for some time, but then we saw her lips form the words rather than heard the sound. "Father, mother, Harry, Archie." Then, as if it were a new idea throwing a filmy shadow over her darkened mind. "But you will be alone, Jessie." Miss Jessie had been feeling this all during the silence, I think, for the tears rolled down her cheeks like rain at these words, and she could not answer at first. Then she put her hands together tight and lifted them up and said, but not to us, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." In a few moments more Miss Brown lay calm and still, never to sorrow or murmur more. After this second funeral, Miss Jenkins insisted that Miss Jessie should come to stay with her, rather than go back to the desolate house, which, in fact, we learnt from Miss Jessie, must now be given up, as she had not wherewithal to maintain it. She had something above £20 a year, besides the interest of the money for which the furniture would sell. But she could not live upon that, and so we talked over her qualifications for earning money. "I can sew neatly," said she, "and I like nursing. I think, too, I could manage a house if anyone would try me as housekeeper. Or I would go into a shop as saleswoman, if they would have patience with me at first." Miss Jenkins declared in an angry voice that she should do no such thing, and talked to herself about some people having no idea of their rank as a captain's daughter, nearly an hour afterwards, when she brought Miss Jessie up a basin of delicately made arrowroot, and stood over her like a dragoon until the last spoonful was finished. Then she disappeared. Miss Jessie began to tell me some more of the plans which had suggested themselves to her, and insensibly fell into talking of the days that were past and gone, and interested me so much I neither knew nor heeded how time passed. We were both startled when Miss Jenkins reappeared and caught us crying. I was afraid lest she would be displeased, as she often said that crying hindered digestion, and I knew she wanted Miss Jessie to get strong, but instead she looked queer and excited and fidgeted around us without saying anything. At last she spoke. "I have been so much startled. No, I have not been at all startled. Don't mind me, my dear Miss Jessie. I have been very much surprised. In fact, I've had a caller whom you knew once, my dear Miss Jessie." Miss Jessie went very white, then flushed scarlet, and looked eagerly at Miss Jenkins. "A gentleman, my dear, who wants to know if you would see him." "Is it—" "It is not," stammered out Miss Jessie, and got no further. "This is his card," said Miss Jenkins, giving it to Miss Jessie, and while her head was bent over it, Miss Jenkins went through a series of winks and odd faces to me, and formed her lips into a long sentence, of which, of course, I could not understand a word. "May he come up?" asked Miss Jenkins at last. "Oh yes, certainly," said Miss Jessie, as much as to say, "This is your house. You may show any visitor where you like." She took up some knitting of Miss Mattie's, and began to be very busy, though I could see how she trembled all over. Miss Jenkins rang the bell, and told the servant who answered it to show Major Gordon upstairs, and presently in walked a tall, fine, frank-looking man of 40 or upwards. He shook hands with Miss Jessie, but he could not see her eyes. She kept them so fixed on the ground. Miss Jenkins asked me if I would come and help her to tie up the preserves in the storeroom, and though Miss Jessie plucked at my gown, and even looked up at me with begging eyes, I durst not refuse to go where Miss Jenkins asked. Instead of tying up preserves in the storeroom, however, we went to talk in the dining-room, and there Miss Jenkins told me what Major Gordon had told her, how he had served in the same regiment with Captain Brown, and had become acquainted with Miss Jessie, then a sweet-looking, blooming girl of 18, how the acquaintance had grown into love on his part, though it had been some years before he had spoken, how, on becoming possessed, through the will of an uncle, of a good estate in Scotland, he had offered and been refused, though with so much agitation and evident distress that he was sure she was not indifferent to him, and how he had discovered that the obstacle was the fell disease which was, even then, too surely threatening her sister. She had mentioned that the surgeons foretold intense suffering, and there was no one but herself to nurse her poor Mary, or cheer and comfort her father during the time of illness. They had had long discussions, and on her refusal to pledge herself to him as his wife when all should be over, he had grown angry and broken off entirely and gone abroad, believing that she was a cold-hearted person whom he would do well to forget. He had been travelling in the East, and was on his return home, when at Rome he saw the account of Captain Brown's death in Galignani. Just then Miss Matty, who had been out all the morning, and had only lately returned to the house, burst in with a face of dismay and outraged propriety. "Oh, goodness me," she said. "DebORah, there's a gentleman sitting in the drawing-room with his arm around Miss Jessie's waist." Miss Matty's eyes looked large with terror. Miss Jenkins snubbed her down in an instant. "The most proper place in the world for his arm to be in. Go away, Matilda, and mind your own business." This from her sister, who had hitherto been a model of feminine decorum, was a blow for poor Miss Matty, and with a double shock she left the room. The last time I ever saw poor Miss Jenkins was many years after this. Mrs. Gordon had kept up a warm and affectionate intercourse with all at Cranford. Miss Jenkins, Miss Matty, and Miss Pole had all been to visit her, and returned with wonderful accounts of her house, her husband, her dress, and her looks. For with happiness something of her early bloom returned. She had been a year or two younger than we had taken her for. Her eyes were always lovely, and as Mrs. Gordon, her dimples were not out of place. At the time to which I have referred, when I last saw Miss Jenkins, that lady was old and feeble, and had lost something of her strong mind. Little Flora Gordon was staying with the Mrs. Jenkins, and when I came in she was reading aloud to Miss Jenkins, who lay feeble and changed on the sofa. Flora put down the Rambler when I came in. "Ah," said Miss Jenkins, "you find me changed, my dear. I can't see as I used to do. If Flora were not here to read to me, I hardly know how I should get through the day. Did you ever read The Rambler? It's a wonderful book, wonderful, and the most improving reading for Flora, which I dare say it would have been if she could have read half the words without spelling, and could have understood the meaning of a third. Better than that strange old book with the queer name poor Captain Brown was killed for reading. That book by Mr. Boz, you know, Old Poz. When I was a girl, but that's a long time ago. I acted Lucy in Old Poz." She babbled on long enough for Flora to get a good long spell at The Christmas Carol, which Miss Matty had left on the table. End of Chapter 2.
All right. So, a lot happened in that chapter. I'm sure you figured it out, but just to make sure that the import of what Miss Jenkins does matters. When Jessie wants to walk to her father's funeral, that's just simply not done. Certainly not by a woman. Not at this time. It wouldn't have been part of the fabric of that society. Why? Because why do we know this? We know this because Queen Victoria didn't walk behind Albert's coffin or to Albert's funeral. So if Victoria didn't do it, nobody should be doing it, right? It makes what Miss Jenkins does so, I thought, so beautiful. They do a really nice job with this in the miniseries as well. But this is one of the reasons why I love this book, because Miss Jenkins is so easy to stereotype as the kind of dry, old, cranky, crotchety woman who is just stuck in her own ways and bosses everybody else around, and her word is law in the home, and that's just it. You don't argue with her ever. And yet, yeah, she may be the arbiter of what is good and right and proper etiquette as far as Cranford goes. But because of that, she has a responsibility to also lead the way, sometimes in groundbreaking ways. This would have been one of those groundbreaking moments. So I just love that. There's a lot of Job that's been quoted in here. Where the weary are at rest is Job 3:17. There's also another cut from it shortly after that. The I will trust in him, that comes from Job 13:15. And it doesn't surprise me that it's Jessie who's saying these, Jessie who sacrificed so much for her sister and her father. And I think because of that, Elizabeth Gaskell knows that we need the end to this chapter framed out the way it is. I loved the Miss Jenkins being very kind of snooty. Like, his arm is in exactly the right place. They should be in there getting back together again. Leave him alone. Let the girl have some fun. Back off. Again, Miss Jenkins will just keep surprising you. I love her. They all do. They all have moments where they surprise you. Jessie's job hunt, when she goes describing the kinds of things that she could do, is heartbreaking. And literally, chapter 4 in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication on the Rights of Women. I know I keep going back to it. It's because rereading it again, I realized I didn't read the whole thing when I was in grad school. We read parts of chapters. We read the Norton anthology, anthologized version. It was like the good parts version. Reading the whole thing again, holy cow, nothing has changed. I mean, some things have changed. Some things have changed. Some things are changing back. Mary Wollstonecraft would be really ticked off right now. Yeah, surprises are always fun, but getting reminded of what Jessie was looking at happening is hard because she's not wrong. And Elizabeth Gaskell can't let us sit there. So she brings back Jessie's love. And that just made me so happy. Rasselas. Miss Jenkins mentions Rasselas last chapter when she was arguing with the captain about who's the better writer, basically Dickens or Samuel Johnson. I didn't look up quotes back then, but I did now because I think it gives us some insight into Miss Jenkins. Rasselas was Samuel Johnson's only novel. It's an allegorical novel about the Prince of Abyssinia. And I was looking at the description and I thought, oh, yeah, we don't need to do that, right? Then I pulled up and I have it on my phone so I can read it to you. I pulled up best lines or best quotes, famous quotes from Rasselas. And I just want to read a couple of these to you because Miss Jenkins cites it as something she loves. The first most famous quote fits that bill perfectly. What we hope ever to do with ease, we must first learn to do with diligence. Makes sense. The next one surprised me. Marriage has many pains, but celibacy has no pleasures. Ooh. Oh. Nothing will ever be attempted if all possible objections must first be overcome. Life is not long, and too much of it should not be spent in idle deliberation how it shall be spent. This is one of the favorite books of a woman who never married, never had an opportunity to marry, let's be honest, and who is very judgy McJudge Pants in her home and town. And yet Samuel Johnson has lines like that in this book. I don't know, it just surprised me. And I think it's one of those other ways that if we were living back then, we probably would have read Rasselas and we would have known when she brought it up that it was a book of a little bit more depth or maybe not depth, but nuance than what I would have expected from her. So I love being surprised by that stuff. Now, the thing that happens at the very, very end of the chapter, and I have to bring out my copy of the book right now. The thing that happens at the end of the chapter is complicated, and I wasn't sure if it would make sense to you as you were listening. So we're going to put it on the screen if you're watching YouTube, but if you're listening at home, I will read this part to you. So The Rambler was published in parts because it was essays. So it was coming out in magazine form. And Miss Jessie is married. She's now Mrs. Gordon. Her daughter, Flora Gordon, is sitting there reading to Miss Jenkins, who has changed. This is Mary Smith telling us about the last time she sees Miss Jenkins in the future. So this does not happen at the same time, clearly, because Jessie is now Mrs. Gordon with a child who can read. But then Miss Jenkins says, to Mary Smith, "You find me changed, my dear. I can't see as I used to do. If Flora were not here to read to me, I hardly know how I should get through the day. Did you ever read The Rambler? It's a wonderful book. Wonderful. And the most improving reading for Flora, which I dare say it would have been if she could have read half the words without spelling and could have understood the meaning of a third." I love that. So like with Rasselas, in The Rambler, which were, like I said, all essays, some of Samuel Johnson's favorite quotes from that are, "On perseverance and diligence, great works are performed not by strength, but by perseverance. On imitation," you may have heard this one before, "no man was ever great by imitation." And on London, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford." That one I talked about last week. So again, Samuel Johnson may be dry and kind of a lot for a kid to read, but not as judgy and prudish as I thought he was. Just saying. Heather's revising. But then the really important bit is Miss Jenkins goes on, having talked about how The Rambler was a wonderful book. And she's talking about it as a book because once the essays were all published, they were bound as a book and sold as a book. "Better than that strange old book with the queer name poor Captain Brown was killed for reading." All right, so she's conflated her dislike of the Pickwick Papers. Mr. Brown was not reading the book and a train hit him. He was reading a book, distracted, sure, looked up from it, saw the kid. If he hadn't been reading, might he have seen the child sooner and gotten the child off the tracks? We don't know. But in Miss Jenkins' mind, he was killed for reading the Pickwick Papers. That book by Mr. Boz, you know. And then there's an M dash, and it says, "Old Pause, P-O-Z. When I was a girl, but that's a long time ago, I acted Lucy in Old Pause. She babbled on long enough for Flora to get a good look at, for a good long spell at the Christmas Carol, which Miss Mattie had left on the table." So Flora, while Mary Smith and Miss Jenkins are talking about Old Pause, which we'll get to in a second, the little girl's looking side-eye at the table where Miss Mattie left A Christmas Carol, so she could read that, something fun and entertaining, and by the Boz, while the two older women are talking about drier things. Drier things being that Old Pause is a kid's book from 1795. And, you know, people would do pantomimes, or they do little plays of famous stories and books because no TV. So when she says, "I played Lucy," Lucy's one of the characters in Old Pause. And actually, I think she's the main character. So this is a beautiful bit of writing to show Miss Jessie's mind starting to loosen its tethers, that she goes seamlessly between The Rambler, her argument with Captain Brown, Brown reading the Pickwick Papers, Old Boz, and Pause, P-O-Z, and a story about something from her life. You can just kind of watch her brain meandering along, and yeah, she's getting old. And that is, in fact, of course, what Mary Smith said too, that she was kind of losing her touch at that point. So, some beautiful writing by Miss Gaskell. Mrs. Gaskell Love her. She preferred to be called Mrs. Gaskell. It was a point of pride for her. I think her husband was lovely and it was respectable. And she was a minister's wife. She needed to be respectable. And she loved it. All right. That is the end of chapter 2. Next week, we'll do chapter 3. And don't forget to enter the raffle. If you want to join us for book club parties, where we all get together over on Discord and talk about whatever the book is for the month, you can do that. Or you can also sign up to join us for watch parties. These always occur on the last Thursday of every month. The watch parties are often, not always, but often we'll do a book, read the book, and then the next month we'll watch the movie. End of March, we watched Rebecca, the Hitchcock Rebecca. And in February, we read Rebecca. There's a whole list of the books for the rest of the year that we will put into the show notes for you in case you're interested, and a link to a way that you can arrange to join us as a one-off. Like you don't have to become a monthly recurring member. You can get into those parties in a couple different ways. So, with that, I hope to see you at one of them. And yeah, have a great, great time. I will talk to you soon. Take care. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on. Bye. You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.